we go. So everyone, we're recording at the moment, and we will no doubt, Stephen will no doubt make this available somewhere. It's my very great pleasure to welcome today Professor William Beinart, who is not only a giant of South African history, but in my experience, one of the most personable, approachable, and engaging scholars of South African history. Students who are joining at the moment, some of you will have encountered Professor Beinart's work through a number of books. And I remember a few years ago, him telling me that he actually did manage to make some money off his publishing through 20th century South Africa. So there's hope for you all yet, but you have to publish something like that. You know, I always feel a bit silly saying his publications are too numerous to mention, but they really are. And they are really, really interesting. I've learned about all sorts of amazing things from William, including, for instance, that the science of forensic examination of animals, so veterinary forensic examination, got a head start, a sort of an indigenous head start in South Africa compared to other parts of the world because of traditional ways of thinking about and looking after livestock. So on that note, welcome, William. I'm going to shut off my video now and leave you to talk for about half an hour, and then we're going to take questions as we go along. Remember, everyone, to keep yourselves muted, and you can either put your questions in the chat or you can put up a hand. And when you do all of those things, just remember that it requires flipping through screens, although I do have two screens on the go here. So just be patient if we don't get your question immediately. William, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for asking me to give this talk. I have been told that this is not a historical seminar per se, but adventures in history and or journeys. And the idea is to try and talk about how research was done and why I landed on the particular routes in researching this book on prickly pear with Luvuyo Wotshela, who's now Professor of History and Director of NAHEX at the University of Johannesburg. How we came about researching this and what adventures that led us into. The book, by the way, is still available from Wits University Press, but there will be a new edition with another publisher in a few months. And researching it was an adventure. Both of us, in different ways, were immersed in Eastern Cape history, and it opened up new avenues for us, as well as many new social and ecological issues. It also led us into conversations and relationships, mostly short-term, I have to say, with many people. Can you hear me? Yeah. It led me into many interesting conversations, and there is an excitement of shared interest, I find, in doing oral history, in doing interviews. So why research the history of the plant, and how on earth did we end up with prickly pear? Someone who worked on livestock in the Eastern Cape once asked me that at a seminar at Rhodes, implying that prickly pear were not very important, certainly compared with livestock. And I expect I have to agree, sort of, that that's the case. But my response was that prickly pear may not have been very important, but their history is very interesting. And we would argue that for thousands of impoverished Black women in small towns and on the farmlands of the Eastern Cape, the plant was quite important for about 200 years. It started for me with a book I did on the rise of conservation in South Africa, looking at the long-term development of conservationist ideas and policies, and concentrating mostly on the rise of commercial sheep farming, its impact on the veld, the natural environment, and understandings of environmental degradation and the policies to manage it. And prickly pear, which is a Mexican plant, had managed to get to Graaff-Reinet by 1760, the new center of, or the early center of colonial livestock farming on the frontier of the colony. And for many years, it was seen as a very useful plant. That's just a better illustration. The big leaf is called a cladode, and then it has fruit and flowers coming off that. Prickly pear was on many Karoo farms. Here's a late 19th century picture. You can see the plant in the middle of the picture, and then new plants growing on the side. And it was, well, there were ways of using it, especially for fodder. And this is an Eastern Cape invention. There have been some to chop up prickly pear and aloe leaf for feeding, especially of ostriches, interestingly enough. So the ostrich boom was connected with the expansion of prickly pear. And this is an interesting picture I found in the Cape archives. And in the front is, in the wagon, are spineless cactus cladodes, then the ostriches, and in the back you can see the prickly pear plants. But prickly pear became invasive, so that many farms in the Karoo and parts of the Eastern Cape became covered with it, really. And you can see that from the top picture over here. So the attitudes, especially of the wealthier, bigger livestock farmers, turned against it. And the reason I got so interested in it, there were actually 4 Cape parliamentary select committees on prickly pear about how to control it. And the story shifted, in a sense, from the Cape and mechanical control, chopping it out, to entomological story, the origins of biological control, in which historically South Africa has been a global leader. And that took me to the Pretoria archives and a huge number of files there, as well as a book by the American entomologist Petty. And this all took 1 chapter in Rise of Conservation. So you can see that this is Graaff-Reinet farm. The biological control was successful by the 50s, was pretty much wiped out in about 90% of the area where it had been invasive. But I've been aware this wasn't the whole story, and that in earlier years when I'd been in the Eastern Cape doing research, it was impossible not to notice in the early months of the year fruit sellers along the road. Luvuyo Wotshela was a doctoral student at Oxford, and he was returning at that stage. He didn't actually have a job, and we were talking about this and other things, and I found some research money for him to go and talk to fruit sellers to see if we could get the African side of the story in more detail. He lived in Fort Beaufort, and he started interviewing with fruit sellers. Sorry, that was just to indicate the plant ended up all over the place in Botswana as well. So this was taken by Luvuyo in about 2003 or 4, and it's impossible in a way. The same part of the central square of town still has prickly pear sellers. He went back this year to do a bit more research, and it's impossible not to notice them. And he followed up with interviews around Alice, Middledrift, and as far afield as Queenstown and Heru, about 150 kilometers away, because he was developing his thesis into a book, and just asked people he saw a little bit about the plant. And then we came across, or he initially came across the plant in a significant number of gardens, and later we traveled a couple of roads counting the number of prickly pear plants in small African plots, and found about 1 in 5 had them. This is near Carmastone. So the material he was finding became so interesting that we decided that it might be worthwhile pursuing it further. And in 2004 and 5, we spent a period interviewing together. We had a stroke of luck. In Fort Beaufort, in the township, we stopped by a fruit seller and we found Nowanile Ngele. She was then in her mid-70s, and although very poor, and as you can see, living in a shack in the Bafolo area across the road from the football stadium, from a farm worker background, she was highly articulate, immediately interested in our research, had a curiosity and a capacity to describe. Every now and again doing field work, I'm sure you've all found out, if you have done it, you just hit somebody who understands clearly what you're trying to do. And she being retired and we being able to pay her a little, joined in the research with enthusiasm and got her group involved as well. And we worked with her and her group of pickers, and we found out brewers for some weeks and then went back to them in later years. And quite clearly, with other opportunities in another life, she would have had a different sort of career, probably been a university student and further. So it was through this group of women that we got involved in a detailed, almost anthropological we were going with them in their various activities. We got involved in the story of picking, and immediately all sorts of interesting different angles came up. The first is that they used to pick on farms around Fort Beaufort, but the farms were closed to them round about 2000 or so. And the farms were closed to them because the white farm owners were switching to game farming and eradicating prickly pear, or they were worried about African people coming onto their farms at a time when land reform was beginning to get going, or they felt insecure. And so the group of women in Fort Beaufort Township who were making a living out, or some of their living out of picking and selling fruit, had to club together and hire bucky owners and find other sources. And in fact, they traveled about 70 kilometers to a municipally owned farm just north of Grahamstown, which this is it. And by chance, it had been invaded by prickly pear. The cochineal insect, which destroyed much of the Karoo prickly pear, was not so effective in these wetter areas. And so this prickly pear survived and this is a terribly important farm. Probably hundreds of pickers come here every year, and there are others around Uitenhage and elsewhere. And we've argued very strongly that they should be maintained. They probably are the source for over R1 million of sold prickly pear. So even more intriguing, we found that this group were involved in brewing as well. And the brewing story is very, very fascinating. The beer made from prickly pear, Tolofia, is called Ikrilika, and that is derived from a Khoisan word, of which the Afrikaans version is kari. And it's a form of fruit beer, which is made by allowing the fruit, having been cut, to ferment, and then adding a mesembryanthemum plant as a fermentation agent, or greater fermentation agent. And this, by chance, happens to be the way that honey beer is made. And honey beer is very deep. There's a very deep history of brewing amongst Khoisan people of honey beer. So this story was beginning to take us with an introduced exotic plant into the history of the adaptation of indigenous knowledge. And the records also showed, the written records, that there'd been considerable brewing going back to the 1870s, I think was our first record, probably earlier, of prickly pear fruit. And it, along with honey beer, even to a greater extent, and Komboti, made from sorghum and maize had been a very major source of alcohol, fruit alcohol, in the Eastern Cape. So this took us along fascinating new routes, discussing how it was made, how it was distributed, mostly informally and without much ceremony. This is all in Fort Beaufort Township. But intriguingly as well, people had to get hold of the Mesembryanthemum species that was used in fermentation. And so we went out with Nowonela and went to a farm and became involved in a whole another network, because alongside the informal economic network around picking and selling and brewing and distributing the liquor, there was also a parallel informal network around finding the Muller, not so big. And yet other stories came out. For example, the use of a lichen to purify the Muller when it went a little bit sour. We began then to understand better the reach of the informal commercial economy and the culture around prickly pear. And this was really the basis of 2 or 3 of our chapters. And this took us off in many different directions. So this, I like this picture of Nowonela, who is featured quite heavily in our book. We couldn't publish the color version. I'll leave that. So it took us in many different directions, collecting Muller on an Adelaide farm. And then we interviewed Tony Dole, the head of the herbarium at Rhodes University, who was interested and had written about honey beer, and discovered that Garth Cambray had done a doctorate on the fermentation involved in indigenous beers, and including honey beer. He was a chemist, and he had actually founded a factory, the commercial honey beer factory in Grahamstown. And he introduced us to other sellers there, Zintombi Zabo in particular. So our networks were spreading out in different towns. We also went to interview the farmers around Fort Beaufort to find out why they'd shut down their farms. And this led us to one of our most fascinating interviews, because one of the farmers employed a fence maker who spent his time during the days, of course, going out across the countryside with the team building fences. But he himself collected the Muller, the fermentation agent. And so we kind of got an inside story of how this was done and where he sold it, and he brewed himself. At the same time, we were trying to learn about the 11 different species of Opuntia introduced, and the different forms of cactus and spineless cactus. And this one in particular, jointed cactus, Ukachi in isiXhosa, Kaiki in Afrikaans, which has no use to anybody and has been, or still is, a major problem. We also found that prickly pear was significant in white popular culture, especially, but not only, Afrikaner. And you can see on the divisional council, whatever emblem from Port Elizabeth, they have an addo elephant with 2 prickly pear bushes on either side of it. An intriguing intrusion of this plant. Once you start looking for plants and start looking for people who use plants, perspectives change in so many ways, and prickly pear is prominent. You find it all over the place. Many people have stories about it. I also used a farm archive of the Rubidge family near Graafrenet, where they had tried to develop spineless cactus as a major sheep food, only to find that it was all destroyed by the cochineal, the biological campaign in the 1940s. The story of spineless cactus didn't stop there. Spineless cactus was a version of Opuntia, of this cactus, developed outside of South Africa, but many different species or varieties were brought in. And despite the fact that it largely failed because it was destroyed by the cochineal insect, there were attempts to get it going again. By chance, Marco Bruch, agronomist at Fort Hare, had been very interested and had started plantations in the Fort Hare farm for fruit and fodder in the 1970s. And he and others had developed 35 plantations through the former Ciskei as drought fodder reserves. And Ciskei, intriguingly, had been so, I mean, Prickly Pear was seen, in a sense, as an emblem of that area, and they published stamps. This is a first day cover that Marco Bruch gave us. Luvuyo and I then started tracking down other old agricultural officers, and we were sent to Gerard de Kock, who we found in Grootfontein, still alive, an old man, Middelburg, found some old records, and he told us that there were still farmers distilling brandy, a story I'll get onto very, very soon. And we found that at Grootfontein Experimental Farm and College, there was still a young white agricultural officer working with two of the old black men who had helped de Kock earlier, trying to start new spineless plantations. There'd been, I think, for a long time, a hostility to prickly pear and even the spineless varieties amongst commercial farmers, but it was beginning to take off again. And the story of the Ciskei plantations was interesting because this was an adaptation, in a sense, of de Kock's and Bruch's work. Unfortunately, in 1985, during the protests, all of the fences were cut because it was a government scheme, and the livestock came in and they ate the spinous cactus down to the ground, and it's never been resuscitated, though you can still see the remnants of the plantations. We also raced up to Pretoria to go and interview Helmut Zimmermann at the Plant Protection Institute, because he had been one of the best informed person, and he actually tried to start a whole nother story, which is intriguing and came out of both written and oral material. Cochineal, as you may know, is a red colouring, and it's a natural red colouring. It had been developed by indigenous people, in the Aztecs in particular, in Mexico, and since then there have been various attempts to get it going again. It still is produced, and Zimmermann was very keen on trying to get a cochineal industry, a natural red colouring industry going in South Africa. It failed. But this group, de Kock especially, had been involved in another intriguing development, which was the resuscitation or the development of a Prickly Pear Festival at Uitenhage, now Kariga. And there was still quite thick, dense wild prickly pear around the area. And they picked large quantities of it, had produced a recipe book, Prickly Pear, Don't Abuse It, Use It, using recipes that were well known on the farms in the Eastern Cape. Different ways of using fruit, cooking, making jam, making cake. It had a very wide range of uses, difficult to handle, but very valuable in the context where life was not very commoditized. But this was all fading, and so they started the Uitenhage Prickly Pear Festival as a way, around the Uitenhage Museum, as a way of resuscitating, in a sense, Afrikaner folk culture. And we found this very intriguing and went to what turned out in 2005 to be one of the very last Turks Bay feasts, largely Afrikaner, but quite a mixed participation, both in terms of English-speaking networks and Black, I would say probably about 20% black out of the 20,000 who went to the festival. And it was partly a music festival, partly a Prickly Pear Festival, partly a giant outdoor braaivleis. But the key excitement, in a way, was the distillation, the making of farm brandy with this old still from prickly pear spirits, Witblits it was called. And Witblits had been legion on the old farms, used also to some extent for farm workers, and give some sense of the Uitenhage Prickly Pear Festival. It was in a way self-parodying, but also an intriguing event which gave some sense of a post-apartheid Afrikaner society, looking backwards to local popular culture, but in a relatively unassertive way in this particular case. Interestingly, there were a group of African employees of the museum who were in some ways the base of the festival in terms of the labor done and the cooking for it and the making of jams and the helping with distilling. And here too we found a wonderful informant, person on the right in this picture, Rosie Kula, who we're still in touch with. And they also are quite nostalgic about this festival, which survived roughly for 20 years and seems to have died. But the Eastern Cape Museums, I've forgotten what they're called, administration, is quite keen on resuscitating it as a kind of regional festival. There are many festivals, of course. So this is just a few of the routes. And what I found so interesting and exciting about this work is we didn't really know where it would take us. But by this time we decided to do a book. And so we were alert to many new opportunities. And we were raced off around the countryside trying to find out people who knew about it, who wanted to talk about it. And many people did. It's a kind of shared Eastern Cape, nostalgia, which crosses to some extent race, boundaries of race, and to some extent the boundaries of class. Although we did also see how these operated around a plant, and that some particular wealthy commercial livestock owners and now game farm owners were not keen on this plant and were keen to eradicate it. But it was fundamentally a plant of the poor for Black people over nearly 200 years, and also for the white poor in the small towns. For us, this also then was history from below, learning history from people, as it were, on the street sides, the fruit sellers, starting with them and moving along their networks to find out how they talked about the plant and how they used it. Yet the scientists also got involved, and this wasn't simply a case of science versus local knowledge at all. It is true that entomological science was used to help eradicate much of the prickly pear, but the scientists like Zimmerman and Brutsch actually changed their views, and by the 70s and 80s were becoming proponents and saying, well, look, this fruit is important for poor people. Let's try to develop fruit-bearing species and try to develop spinous cactus plantations that might actually help as a drought fodder. And scientists now, particularly a group at Bloemfontein, are very keen and are trying to promote the plant, even though it's an exotic, because it's seen as a plant of climate change, of global warming. And with the western side of Southern Africa predicted to dry up, it is cactuses like this that can survive with relatively little water, but provide potentially quite good food and fodder resources. Another intriguing element of it was the plasticity of plants. So in certain forms, in its spiny form, it was much more dangerous. In its cultivated spineless form, it was potentially very usable, but it was extremely difficult to control the spiny variety. At the moment, it is probably controlled. Working for Water have been hostile to it and trying to eradicate it further, but it survives in pockets in the Eastern Cape. And Luvuyo's just been interviewing around a few of our old spots because for our second edition, and has found, although it's difficult to be precise without a lot more work, that the informal fruit selling market is probably as alive as ever, although not the brewing market, although it does seem, he was told in Fort Beaufort, Buffalo Township, that when there was the clampdown on alcohol as part of the COVID controls, the brewing of Iqilika got a bit of a spur, a bit of a revival. And then lastly, the issue of biodiversity. For us, this is so interesting. At what point does a plant become naturalized? Is prickly pear a threat to biodiversity, as it was when it became rampantly invasive? Or is it actually now part of biodiversity, and in the sense that it's relatively controlled and provides significant value still for poor, particularly rural women and small town women? Should we see it as a benefit, and to reconceptualize biodiversity, not only to include indigenous, but also introduce species? So for us, it opened up lots of areas, and we very much enjoyed doing this research, largely in fairly small bits and pieces through the years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, William. That was really excellent. I have been keeping a list of questions going for myself, which I'll slip in at the end if I may. But I can.
Should I switch to stop share? Will that
Yes.
bring me back onto the screen?
That'll bring you back onto the screen, yes.
Okay.
I'm looking at the questions that are popping up in the chat, and that there are a couple of hands. Karen, I can see your hand. I'm going to take that in a second, but I'm just going to read what's in the chat at the moment. So from Naledi Letsoho, we have Professor Beinart. I find this beer brewing information so relevant, especially today, considering the circulating information that today is take a beer to work day on social media. Naledi, do you have a screenshot that you could post? Actually, you can't post screenshots in the chat. That's the most irritating thing. Naledi, if you can send to my email a screenshot of one of those social media posts, I'll post it up on the screen for everyone to share. And then just going back a bit, Amanda Mangena has said, I'm super excited. This is like a dream come true for me. So Amanda, I hope you're working on your question. And Karen, then it's over to you. If you can, will you put your video on so that we can see your face?
I would love to put my video on, but I'm afraid it's still early in the morning here in Brazil, and I haven't brushed my hair or washed my face or anything, I'm afraid. So I look quite awful. So let me just say, I don't have a question exactly, but I was very interested in this talk because my mother is from the Eastern Cape, and we grew up in the Western Cape, but my mom would always try once a year to get Turksfeyer, and she would cut them up, and we'd have a little feast. And I was very interested in what you were saying, Professor, about the Turksfeyer feast that there used to be, because about six years ago, I went on a little trip with my mom to the Eastern Cape, and we went to Patensi, where they were having this citrus festival. And it was one of the most horrendous experiences of my life, because as you came into the festival, the first stall that you encountered was a massive stall selling all kinds of paraphernalia covered in the old South African flag. And it was really upsetting to see, not only to see that, but to see how the people were just flocking to it and buying things and adoring this old South African flag. And I was wondering if that was, I know that you said that the Turkspefius was kind of more innocuous, but also a little bit not, I wouldn't say nationalistic, but promoting Afrikaans culture. And I wonder if that was maybe one of the reasons why it stopped happening, because of problems with the way Afrikaans people or Afrikaans identity is seen in South Africa today.
Thanks. It's a very interesting question. And intriguingly, we did interview in Patensie as well. And the reason was that at the Uitenhage Festival in 2005, Kariga Festival now, we came across the local librarian, who came from the Milan family. And the Milan family are big citrus farmers in Patensie. And we went out there to interview, and there was a fascinating story that the whole of that Patensie Valley, Gamtoos Valley, had been covered in prickly pear, very thick at one time, really invasive. And it was the development of citrus, especially after the building of the Kucha Dam, which provided the water supplies and the capital and the subsidies that came through that. One of the Milans was the local MP. That resulted in the clearing of prickly pear and the expansion of citrus. So it is an interesting, potentially connected with what you're saying. I interviewed there, or Luvuyo and I interviewed there, and also found that there were quite a bit of prickly pear left in Hankie and Patensie. We didn't go into great detail about the political loyalties of that group of farmers, but it is quite a significant citrus area. With respect to the dying of the Prickly Pear Festival, I think it's 2007 was the last one. It was just that the group who really gave it the impetus were an aging group of Afrikaners who had connected with the museum. I think they were called the Friends, Museum Vriende. And Alta Milan, who was the key woman involved, was in her 70s and actually died shortly after. And I think that they just lost their momentum. It was a big thing to organize. It was expensive. They got the big crowds largely through hiring fairly well-known bands. And one of those was, I think a couple of them were, Steve Hofmeyer came one year, and I do know that he has a reputation of being quite a strong, what's the right word, Afrikaner, others will correct me, but I think he's quite assertive about Afrikaner culture. Yet, and one saw elements of it. For example, there was a group doing Volksspieler, but at the festival itself, there were quite a few black acts on stage and people involved in prickly pear product sales and so on. So we didn't get the strong impression that it was highly nationalistic. It did survive in a form through one of the schools, and it's called the Annie Brandtfees. I don't know what that is, but it doesn't actually feature prickly pear. The group of African workers at the museum, who Luvuyo's just interviewed again, especially Rosie Kula, are very keen to start it again. So they don't see it quite in the way that it might have been an assertion simply of Afrikaner culture. But of course, they would like to start it as a much more broadly based, I expect, festival. They'll need government subsidy and have to find an organizing committee to do it, so I really don't know if it'll get going again. I hope that starts to answer your question.
Yes, that's great. Thank you very much. That's very interesting. Thank you.
Points. I mean, all the festivals, you know, there's the Oudtshoorn Festival, the Klein Karoo Festival, where they're explicitly trying to, what's the right word, reframe Afrikaans as a much less white language, and to develop, as I understand it, a kind of cultural world, a cultural expression of Afrikanerdom, which is truly non-racial or cross-racial. And that, so, but I'm sure all of the different festivals and have their own particular organizing groups and agendas.
Thanks, William. I'm just thinking that Oudtshoorn Festival is rather unfortunately known as the KKK, isn't it? There are a couple of hands up. I know I can see Gerald has a question. I know Stephen Sparks has a question. And Amanda, I saw your hand go up briefly. Good, I'm glad to see that up. Before I take the questions from the research, the staff of the history department, I think let's go for what we can get from some of our amazing postgrads. Amanda, are you willing to come online? Great.
Yes, good day, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity. And as you can see, I have a big, bright smile because last year when I was doing my research, I used a lot of Prof. Beinart's work. So like my proposal, more than, I don't know how many times I actually referenced his book, 21st Century South Africa. So I want to ask a question about how important is it for one as a historian to be able to diversify, because when reading the book or the ones that I used, I noticed that he was focusing more on social histories of Southern Africa, and then looking at the presentation that he was giving us now, it's more on environmental history. So how important or how easy is it for one to diversify as a historian and as a researcher? Thank you.
Thanks. Should I answer now, Natasha? Okay.
Yes, well, please do answer.
Yes, good. I think, so for a long time, because I started out training initially UCT, but then at London, where there was a very strong sense that we had to change the shape of history and try to look at history from below, try to look at African experiences and the experiences of poorer people in the colonized, and rewrite history from that vantage point. And that, I think you just have to go where your material and ideas begin to take you. So initially, I was always interested in how rural people used their environment, because my focus was largely on the agrarian side. I was interested in the way that colonization transformed African agriculture and the relative success of African agriculture for many years, and exploring that. And that naturally took me into thinking beyond the social and economic, into the environmental as well. And reading around and reading literatures from other places, environmental history as a, let's say, a self-identified area was beginning to gain ground, especially in the United States. And so I was attracted to try and connect these different things. And I also have found reading some of the older books around plants, which try to bridge history, biology, environment. There's a famous book, which I came across by chance early in my career, called The Social History of the Potato. And you might say, well, potatoes, I accept, are more important than prickly pears. But it's a very fascinating attempt to look back at the spread of the potato from Peru through the world, but in particular to look at some key moments such as the Irish potato famine in the 1840s, where the failure of the potato crop had a devastating impact, coupled with what was then British colonial policy in Ireland, and led to the emigration of literally millions of Irish people, mostly to the United States, of course. So I was attuned to all of these things, and when in a sense, going along the route of trying to follow the history of a plant attracted me. And Luvuyo got equally enthusiastic when he started doing his interviewing after he came back from his Oxford thesis. He wasn't working on prickly pear, but going to talk to poor rural women in villages around the former Ciskei alerted him to the potentiality of it. So I would say, and the roots into indigenous knowledge. So there's now a very significant volume of research developing around botanical indigenous knowledge in South Africa, and much of it is quite general, but there are increasingly detailed studies, particularly I expect on medicinal plants, but I think there's plenty of potential around there. And you may not find such a big archive on other plants, although I think you would say on something like Acacia carew or Wotshela carew, it's now called. But I think there's still quite a lot of potential for joining the social, the environmental, the political, and also the way that science and indigenous knowledge can intertwine in the histories or around the histories of plants.
Thanks, William. Nikiwe has a question for you next, and I'm going to pop one in as well, because I'm looking at the time. I wondered, when you were talking about your interviews, you mentioned you had a small sum of money to give one of your informants, and I know quite a few of the students are dealing with ethics applications around interviewing, and I wondered if you could speak briefly about that, but we'll take Nikiwe's question first. Nikiwe, over to you.
Thanks, Natasha. I am so excited. I'm probably just as excited as Amanda to be here. I feel so honored. I'm even shaking, So this was really interesting, right? I've been doing my master's on conservation and animal studies, particularly animal diseases. So I'm looking at the relationship between colonial science and indigenous knowledge systems in conservation. So I was wondering, especially as a young Black woman in this age of decolonialization, how do we balance the urge to give voices to those who were previously silenced, to give voices and acknowledgement to our indigenous knowledge systems without really making colonial science look like the devil? So, because I wrote a lot about local indigenous knowledges in conservation, the Kruger Park, and the comment that I kept receiving from my supervisor was that I shouldn't assume that indigenous knowledge was all perfect and everything, and then colonial science was the devil that took everything away. And I like the example that you make about the two plants that were growing together, the invasive and the local growing together, and the festive that you mentioned, that there should kind of be a balance. But as a young historian in environmental history, I've had to work with people outside the history domain, right? So I've had to work with ecologists. I've had to look at work that was in natural sciences, and it was difficult. And I know that you've mentioned in one of your papers that you've also had that challenge, and the fact that history as a discipline doesn't really offer us as historians these scientific skills, right, that the natural sciences do. So I was just wondering, how do we create a balance between giving a voice to those that were previously silenced without making the sciences, the colonial sciences, look like the devil? And how do we become historians who also are aware of the natural sciences and all these other fields? I hope it makes sense. It made sense in my head, but now that I'm trying to say it out loud to you, sir, I'm just so nervous and I'm shaking, but I hope it makes sense. Thanks.
Nikiwe, just thanks very much for that question. William, I just wanted to say that we've got one more question in the chat that I'm going to read to you after you've answered Nikiwe. And then I think because it's going to be almost 2:30, we need to finish. So just to give you a sense of where we're going. So over to you.
Why don't you just do the chat and then I can answer all 3 points that.
Okay. All right. So Busi has a bad line. And so she's asked us to ask you. I'll read their 2 comments. This is so fascinating. Please speak more about writing history using local people's memory and indigenous knowledge. So it is in the same ballpark. It sounds as though people's nostalgia, and she's used scare quotes, also enhance the study. How did you balance this with empirical methods? And then she says, I also haven't seen any men in the pictures with the, the emoji that goes like this. Is there a chapter dealing with the role of rural women in the survival of indigenous knowledge? Thanks.
Well, okay, these are all big questions and I'm going to have to answer them very briefly. So is there 5 minutes more, roughly? Is that right, Natasha?
Yes, there is. And I'm sure that if you take a few more minutes, that's fine as well.
Okay, well, let me deal with your point firstly, and that is ethics and payments. I have done a lot of field work in different parts of South Africa and in Kenya too. And on the whole, I've tried to be fairly rigorous about not paying. But taking those who I interview gifts or small gifts as an acknowledgement of their time, or trying to do something useful, although I can't say I've always succeeded, but I can explain what I mean by that if you'd like me to. In this case, it was slightly different because once we came across Nwanyela, she, in a sense, became a research assistant, is what she, organized for us to come, and she organized us to talk to, or helped to organize for us to talk to other people. She hosted a couple of days when we watched the brewing process throughout, and we felt that we had to recognize her both as an informant and, in a sense, as an assistant. And that's why we went beyond simply giving very small gifts. And yeah, I accept that these boundaries are often difficult and people sometimes ask for money. By no means always. I expect inevitably people will, as time goes on, more often ask. But that's my explanation of what happened, because that's how it happened. And but it is difficult as well if you're taking up, I mean, sometimes interviews are, so another example, when I did work on indigenous veterinary knowledge, which you mentioned briefly, I tried to compensate in two ways. So there was one particular man who spent about, I would say I've spent about 15 to 16 hours with him. He was locally the best known person. And in his case as well, because I felt he had gone beyond, you know, a 2-hour interview, but was really sharing knowledge and assisting in other ways. I also paid him for his time. And in the village as a whole, I worked with a couple of other people to raise money for a new dipping tank or to improve the dipping tank. So it's complicated as to how one can recompense, and people do ask you. I think that the main thing is to try to be honest and say you're doing research, you're not from the government, you can't necessarily help people, and they have to accept you on the terms that you can offer. But if they are actually providing research assistance, then I think it's wise to try to make sure that they benefit from that, or at least that that's acknowledged financially. Then the issue of different sciences. You know, it's so difficult. I think when one tries to look at this as very broad brush and see contestation between colonial science and science in the colonies, as we argue, not all colonial science is immediately in the interests of a particular type of colonization or particular colonial interests, and indigenous knowledge, which also varies very greatly, of course, that these issues are often dealt with more effectively, I think, in particular stories or particular research strands. So when I got into this first, just as an example, I was looking at the betterment schemes, and there'd been a lot of rural resistance to the betterment schemes. This is forced villagization and culling of cattle and so on. And my assessment was that they were coercive, although in some places we do know that people were convinced that they might be effective or might be valuable, and people moved voluntarily. But on the whole, I think that they were coercive. They were not thought through adequately, and they've left us with a context now which is not very effective for rural development and, in my view, and agricultural reform, or the resuscitation of smallholding in South Africa. Now, I won't try to give you all the reasons now because it's a complicated debate. So in that context, I'm not saying that the colonial agricultural officers who enforced this, who then, I should say, in somewhere like the Transkei, were largely black by the 70s and 80s, in the final years of the enforcement of the policy. I'm not saying that they were entirely wrong in their diagnosis of the problems of rural smallholding in a context of mass migrant labor. I don't think they had sufficient social understanding, political understanding. Nevertheless, what they enforced, what they implemented, I don't think was the best route by any means. And so, and yet, if you look at a story like the Prickly Pear, it has those elements, but it also has counter forces. So there's no doubt that the initial attempts at eradication of prickly pear, and relatively successful through the introduction of the insects from the Americas, favored the large livestock owners. It was they who wanted to get rid of it. And in the areas where they got rid of it, poorer people who were dependent on it, or not dependent on it, but used it for fruit and small income supplements going back, you know, many, many decades, lost out. So, and if you read the archive of the implementation of eradication, these social issues didn't arise for the state and the agricultural officers, and they saw it as, in general, a good thing. However, it is intriguing that by about the 70s and 80s, firstly, scientists get reinterested in the spineless cactus, and scientists such as Zimmerman, who's probably the leading, or was for many years, the leading scientist around biological eradication and the cactus story, he changes his mind. He begins to see that the cochineal and Cactoblastus insects do seem to have established, as it were, control over invasive prickly pear, and that there is value not only in the spineless cactus, but also in the wild prickly pear for rural people. And I think, you know, it's partly, you could say, it was happening at a time when South Africa's politics were starting, and there was a wider, if not very wide, understanding of issues of poverty. And of course, post 94, although the state has continued along some policy lines inherited from apartheid, and working for water is a complicated issue in relation to this, because working for water is still committed to eradication of Opuntia or prickly pear, despite the fact that it is seen as a program that favors the interests of poor people by providing rural employment. But I would say that there is a significant shift in a scientific point of view. But having said that, the 1983 Agricultural Resources Act, CARA, illegalized prickly pear or reinforced its status as a weed. And so actually handling it and selling it, as people do, is strictly speaking illegal, and is one of those many areas of South African life where practice and legal reality don't entirely match up. Brewing, though, which used to be policed and illegal, is now permitted up to, or at least if it's not highly commercial. So what I'm trying to say is that in different contexts or different strands, you will potentially, there are different interrelationships. And also, I think, interestingly, in botany, I've written about this, and I can send it to you if you email me. Whereas, say, something like the debates about AIDS got very polarized between a kind of global scientific view and indigenous knowledge view. In the botanical world, there's been a lot more interplay, and there've been a series of books by botanists and by both white and black scientific workers looking at indigenous knowledge, looking at how this can be incorporated, and looking at the specific potentiality of plants that are used in indigenous knowledge systems for medicinal or veterinary purposes, how they might be pharmacologically tested and potentially, so that different disciplines, different issues, I think, turn out in different ways. Sorry, I'm talking far. And then I don't know if there's really time to answer the last question. What should I do, Natasha?
Do you want to take, do you think you can do a sort of a minute more? We are losing a couple of participants, but then we should probably wrap up. Otherwise, we can always, I think it was Bussi's question. She can be in touch with you
Yes.
separately.
Yes, well, around oral history and what it can tell you. And, you know, I think I'm a devotee of trying to go to the places that I write about. I can't say I always do it, and different sorts of research projects allow it better if one's writing overviews or broad brush books or research things, it's more difficult to do. And trying to think about the world through the eyes, at least to some extent, one can never entirely get into the world views of people that you're interviewing, but it's possible to interview. And I have to say, I'm not an African language speaker. I know a little bit of Xhosa, so I've always had to work through interpreters. Nevertheless, I've not found that to be massively disabling, although it has been lazy of me not to really pursue and master Xhosa. But I think it's very valuable, and people do have very strong insights into their own context and often commentaries on the world as they see it. That helps you to look at, as it were, history from the archive in a slightly different way and to incorporate those stories. So I would say, if you can get the resources and the time, do it, and don't skimp too much. In other words, try not to interview 4 people, try to interview 40 people. And it involves patience, and rural people, for example, are not always patient and don't always turn up when you hope they will. But it can take quite a long time, but I think is worth pursuing. How you use the material is complicated. And in part, of course, it depends how deep you're trying to go. If you're looking at the last 30 or 40 years, I've found the most effective oral history has been around light histories, and then trying to broach your topic through people's personal experiences so that you can locate the person and understand better why they're saying what they're saying. So writing about their views, integrating it into broader stories can be difficult, and one has to accept that the written archive might tell a different story. I've found this particularly in doing some research on land reform, on restitution cases, and I think the crux is really the historian has to take some responsibility, I think, and say where they believe that something has become a social myth, say in the oral version, or where the archive may not itself be justified, or it might give a misleading impression because it's not based on understanding of what has happened to a particular community. And of course, different historians have got different approaches, different politics, different priorities. And if you're in recent years, the urge to be decolonial, to follow from the student movements, say, of 2015, and which have been sustained in many ways, might give you a very particular perspective on colonialism and a less tolerant perspective. Whereas I expect in the political economy and social history approaches beforehand, there was great emphasis on trying to look at African agency, the agency of colonized people. And that sometimes, I expect, created potentiality and space that I don't know if the fallist view, if I can put that shorthand on it, might create the same space, because in a sense it's more, and I'm quite happy to be corrected, more interested in histories of oppression. You have to decide what your view of the world is from your own vantage point. But the critical thing, as you say, is how one links this to evidence and how one links this to the views that the nostalgia, if you want to use that word, interesting. There's always an element of nostalgia in oral history. Interviewing old men in the rural areas, they talk about a life 50, 60 years ago, which seemed much better than it is now. And yet, objectively and empirically, it was a period of great poverty as well, and probably at the peak of migrant labor. So one has to be able to think about what you're hearing and why. Sorry, it's a roundabout answer. It is, for me, very important to be led by evidence.
Thank you, William. I think that's been really, really interesting, and I wouldn't be surprised if we don't get some requests to have you on again as a kind of star witness into history. Thank you, everyone, for attending today, and I rather think that there will be a recording of this available on Facebook, not Facebook, sorry, on YouTube at some point. And have a great weekend, everyone. Do you all want to see if you can't do a kind of one of those kind of rah reactions for William, and then I'm going to sign off. There we go. I managed to do something fancy. Cheers, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your patience and giving me the opportunity to talk about these points.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone.